All right, ladies and gentlemen, welcome back to our Little Shoe Career Pathways video lecture series. Today's lesson is going to be on business tycoons and the evolution of business in the Industrial Revolution. Ooh, forgot my clicker. Hold on just a second. Let's see if we're back in business. Oh, let's make this full screen. Excellent. All right, here we go. So our lesson objectives for the day. Number one is to understand how business practices influenced the Industrial Revolution. Number two is to understand the key concepts of business practices that influence said revolution. So the difference between one and two, basically understanding how business practices influenced. And then number two is basically to understand exactly what those practices were. And then number three is to understand how a concept we're going to talk about called social Darwinism was introduced during this time and its impact on society. So those are going to be all the objectives that we are going to get through in this lesson. The first thing that we're going to do is I'm going to pose a pretty simple question to you, and it's this. If you were to envision what were the richest or whom were the richest people in the history of our society, who would you pick? Who would you envision? Now, I would suppose that if I were to pose this question to most of the people in this country, these three people might come on their short list of people that come to their mind. From left to right, we have Mr. Bill Gates. In the middle, we have Mr. Donald Trump. And on the right, we have Oprah Winfrey, who is one of the, if not the most richest, or the most wealthy female of all time. Now, let's take a look at their net worth, shall we? At their peak, Mr. Bill Gates had a net worth of approximately $76 billion. Nothing to shake a stick at. He is considered by many to be the wealthiest man in the history of the United States. We're going to talk about that more in just a second. Mr. Donald Trump comes in at about $2.1 billion, and Oprah Winfrey comes in at about $3 billion. So, not that I pass up that kind of money. If I were to even get a fraction of that amount of money that they wanted to offer me, I'd be pretty happy with that. But then we have to pose the question, just how high on the list of Americans do these people go? That's going to kind of get us thinking about those key questions for today. If we were to look at where Mr. Bill Gates, who is far and away the leader in the clubhouse in the list that we just looked at, he would not even fall in the list of top 10 wealthiest Americans of all time. All of these men happened to live during the time of the Industrial Revolution, which I would like to think that if you hear me, you hear somebody say that the wealthiest people of all time lived in the Industrial Revolution, it'll hopefully get your brains churning a little bit and start to ask some questions about why that might be. But what you see here is a conglomeration of some of the wealthiest people to ever walk this earth. From left to right, Mr. Andrew Carnegie, Mr. Andrew Mellon, Mr. J.P. Morgan, Mr. Henry Ford, Mr. John D. Rockefeller, and Mr. Cornelius Vanderbilt. Now, just to give you some sense now, so we quickly go back. There you go. Bill Gates, $76 billion. On this list, Mr. Rockefeller over here is going to top the charts. At his net worth, or at his peak, his net worth adjusted for inflation was That's right, $663 billion. So, even, if Bill Gates goes out to dinner with John D. Rockefeller, Rockefeller's like, I don't know, man, can you afford to be at this place? That's how high of a gap there is between those two gentlemen. Mr. Carnegie over here, the steel magnate, $293 billion. Mr. Vanderbilt, 167, Mr. Ford, 188. So that just gives you a pretty good idea of what kind of wealth we're talking about. And the focus that we're going to be going over today is, how does somebody create such a wealth? Now, we talked earlier about the key concepts regarding the Industrial Revolution. We've been talking a lot about in class the Industrial Revolution and the inventions and the manufacturing boom that we saw going on at the turn of the century that led business to explode, cities to explode. And now what we're going to do today is talk about the men really who ran these companies and the practices they employed to become the wealthiest men in history by exploiting the system that was going on during the Industrial Revolution. So really what it comes down to in terms of business practices, we're dealing with two main concepts. The first main concept is going to be vertical integration. Now, I have a little diagram here. So when we're talking about vertical integration, we're talking about production, the production of your process. And when you employ vertical integration, you're going to own all aspects of production. So from beginning to end, you are going to own all aspects of production in whatever it is that your company offers. So, for instance, let's take a look at the Ford Motor Company. We talked about Mr. Ford there a little bit ago, so let's look at his company in the present day. So if we were to consider all the things, from top to bottom, or rather in this case from bottom to top, that he would need to build a car, you can envision things like steel, things like tires, glass or windshields. There's electronics. Move the screen a little bit there. Electronics. Let's see, what else would there be? Well, lighting. So lights. Now, if you were to go into the Ford Motor Company today, most of the products that you will find that they go into building a Ford vehicle are not produced by the Ford Motor Company. They purchase the lights from a different company. They purchase their tires from a Goodyear tire. The same way that you or I would go out and purchase Bridgestone or Goodyear tires. So in a sense, they don't control all their production. If the price of tires skyrockets, that's going to influence how much it costs them to build a car, and therefore it will increase the price to you, the consumer. In vertical integration, you take that out of the equation. The Ford Motor Company would own the steel company. They would own Bridgestone or Goodyear. They would own whatever glass company makes their windshields and their windows. They would own whoever's making the stereo system in their cars. They would own the company making the lights. They would own every single aspect of production. Now, what is the impact? Let's see if we can switch. What is the impact of vertical integration? Well, number one, it gives you complete control of resources. So it gives you complete control of resources. The second thing it allows you to do, other than control all the resources and the price of those resources, is you can gouge the competition. As you can imagine, Ford, as a car-making company, is not the only company that needs steel, that needs tires, glass, electronics, and lights. The Chevy company needs those products as well. Toyota, Honda, all these companies making cars needs the same part. So if you can think about it in terms of production, if Chevy needs to go buy their tires, and really what they're doing is they're buying it from the Ford company, You can imagine how the Ford company might charge the Chevy company a little bit more money to buy their tires, because that will basically be a leg up on the competition. And ultimately, that's the world that is created during this time period, one in which companies compete with each other and they try to run each other out of business, and it still goes on today. And that leads us to our second of our two concepts, which is horizontal consolidation. Now, that has to do with competition. And essentially, what it means, horizontal consolidation, is that you buy out in economic terms, we would call it firms. So it's a concept where you would buy out all the other firms in your industry. So essentially, you can envision if it's the Ford company, they would buy out a Chevy, they would buy out Toyota, Honda. They would make sure that they are the only company that is building cars in the industry. Well, what's the impact of that on the industry? Well, they have total control of the industry. We'll talk about a little bit later this year exactly, or actually you would have talked about this already last year, all the different things that go into economics and the free market system, and how there's a supply and demand, and those influences naturally ebb and flow to regulate a market. If you're the only industry in that market, the only firm in that market, that regulation will go away. You don't have to deal with that. If I want to charge $40,000 for a car, I can do that because there are no other options. Okay? So, why would that happen? So, the other question becomes, so let's say you're Chevy, and the Ford company comes to you and says, Chevy, we're going to buy you out. We'll offer you $2 million for your company, which back then would have probably been quite a bit of money. And if I'm the owner of Chevy, I might say, well, no, Ford, there's no way I'm going to do that. Why would I ever sell my company to you? And they say, well, here's the deal, Chevy. You have two options. You can sell your company to us right now, or we're going to slash our prices. That's Ford talking. Ford's going to slash their prices so much so that everybody's going to buy for us. And you might ask yourself, well, what about all the money you're going to be losing by charging so little money for your cars? Well, Chevy, here's what we're going to do. You know those tires you've been purchasing for us? Every dollar that we're going to lose by charging so little money for our cars, we are going to jack the price of tires up so that essentially you're going to be paying us the difference in money that we're going to lose. And ultimately, because you're paying so much extra for tires and nobody's buying your cars because they're so expensive in comparison to how much the Ford company is selling a car for, you will go out of business. So you have two options, Chevy. You can sell your company to us for $2 million today, or you can go bankrupt and you will get absolutely nothing for your company because we're going to run you out of business, because we can afford to do that because we control all aspects of production in this industry. So ultimately, the Chevy company is going to think about it and they're going to say, you know what, I think that $2 million sounds pretty darn good. We'll take that deal. And then once Chevy does that, that just increases the power of the Ford company, because then they can control all of those plants as well. And they can go to the Honda company and the Toyota company, and each domino that falls becomes easier to push over the next. And ultimately, they control every single aspect of production and of competition in the industry, and therefore would be maximizing full potential. Very bad for the consumer, but obviously you can envision if you were a Mr. Henry Ford at this time, owning every aspect of production and competition in a firm or within an industry, you'd be making quite a bit of money. So, vertical integration, horizontal consolidation, take a moment. If you need to rewatch this slide again, go ahead. Otherwise, we're going to move on. All right, so as we talked about earlier, we had these business magnates, these business tycoons in the industry. These are the men who at this time during the Industrial Revolution were the most successful in making money. So what I'm going to ask you to do at this point is pause the video. Not at this moment because you're not going to understand the activity, but just a second, you're going to pause the video and I want you to do the following. You're going to do a little bit of research on the internet, and what you're going to research is the following things. Number one, how did each one of these people make their money? So, how did Andrew Carnegie make his money, J.P. Morgan, Andrew Mellon, etc.? What were they worth? So look up their net worth. Now some of you might just have to look back to the video in order to get that. And then which strategies that we talked about did they employ? And give me specifics. Don't just say, well, they used vertical integration, horizontal consolidation. Give me a little bit of, the Ford company, these are all the aspects of production they earned. These are all the people they bought out. So do a little bit of application of the things that we just talked about. And then you can come back, and actually, no, I take that back. After you complete that, I want you to write a short 75-word Melcon paragraph that answers the question, who would you want to be? Which one of these people would you want to be, and why? I can envision you going about this in a couple different ways. Number one, maybe it's the production. All these people are wealthy. So maybe you're like, well, I really like cars. I'd want to make cars. So that'd be one thing. You can look at their upbringings a little bit. You can, maybe you do just want that much money and you say, well, this is why I want to do it. This is a little bit of an exercise about who you are and who you'd want to be during this time. All right. So moving on, you've done the activity now. During this time, a rise in a term called social Darwinism began to take hold in the American vernacular. And it's something that still holds true to this day. So social Darwinism, it's a theory based off of Charles Darwin, and I don't know if you've taken in biology and talked about the theories of evolution, but essentially the concept revolves around the idea that whoever is the strongest in society, they will survive and pass those characteristics on to the next generation. In the case of business, in the case of society, it tends to be more along the lines of whoever is the smartest and whoever can be the most resourceful is going to excel in society. And so essentially, as it applies to this business model, the men who were smart enough to think of vertical integration and horizontal consolidation were far superior intellectually and therefore succeeded in society more than other people, and therefore will pass on those successful traits to the people in society after them, the next generation of society, if you will. Applying social Darwinism, that's where economists would come in and say, we shouldn't have any regulation in the markets. Government shouldn't come in and regulate the markets at all. There should be a natural kind of competitive nature about the markets, the economy in our society. The bad news for this kind of model where there's no regulations, as you can imagine, is that if there is no regulation, a company can employ these to, we talk about survival of the fittest. Well, what we saw in business and what we see in society sometimes is that ultimately then renders itself to one business, what we would call a monopoly. And as you remember when we talked about economics last year, in a monopoly, that's horrible for consumers. If I have a monopoly on milk, I can charge $10 a gallon for milk. Well, you can envision the impact that would have on the everyday American family if they had to begin to charge or pay $10 for milk. So ultimately, there's this argument that takes place in our society about a social Darwinist idea where we should be allowed to just have no regulation in the markets, let nature take hold, let the strongest ideas survive, and let those fittest people excel. And then the other side of the coin being looking at the impact that has on our society and the majority of individuals living in that society. So this is something that happened um, that happened back then, that started back then, and it continues today. And this idea really made sense to billionaires and Protestants during this time. So there's a lot of people that said, yeah, we shouldn't have regulation in the markets, that these business tycoons succeeding are good things. Billionaires, you can imagine why they would have thought this was a really good thing. They were the people who could exploit the system for their own personal gain. As far as Protestants are concerned, during this time there was a big push, because sometimes there gets to be religious ideals that, talk about helping, your fellow man and giving what you have to your fellow man and really treating everybody more like it's a socialist community, if you will. Protestants were really pushing during this time to emphasize the parts of religion in the Bible that talk about trying to help yourself. God is willing to help those who help themselves, kind of deal. And really, they were encouraging hard work, and they were hoping that there would be rewards in this world for people who worked hard and did their best. And so they saw this social Darwinist approach to society as being more in line with their religious ideals. So this definitely became something that they promoted as well. One thing I want you to look at, we're going to have this debate in class, but you can just kind of start looking at ideas now. I want you to consider whether or not social Darwinism in your mind is a good thing. This idea that there shouldn't be any regulations, that people should be allowed to do whatever they want in terms of the business world. And I want you to ask yourself, do you think that social Darwinism was a good thing back then, and it still continues to be a good thing today? It was a good thing back then, but it's not a good thing anymore today? Or it wasn't a good thing back then, and it's still not a good thing today? So you're going to consider your viewpoints, get a little bit of firepower for why you think that is the case, and then we're going to have a little bit of debate in class. So that's pretty much it for today's lesson. Let's take a look back at our lesson objectives: to understand how business practices influence the Industrial Revolution. Obviously, like many things in our world, it comes down to money. The men that we talked about during the Industrial Revolution wanted to make money. They had a means to produce, and the Industrial Revolution provided the tools, the steel and the transportation and the inventions and the opportunity for these men to really exploit use their understanding of business practices, and some of these business practices that, ones they invented, to come together, the tools and the right people to really cause that production boom that led to the Industrial Revolution. Key concepts: we talked about vertical integration, which was controlling all aspects of production from top to bottom. And then once you do that, you utilize horizontal consolidation, where you can buy out all the other firms that you are competing with in your industry. And then we talked a little bit about social Darwinism, and how during this time there was this debate about whether or not these business tycoons were good things, that these men were able to exploit industries and run other businesses out of business, and ultimately charge consumers whatever they wanted. And there was this honest debate that continues today about whether or not that was a good thing, that people should be allowed to succeed through their good ideas, or whether or not it's a bad thing because of the impact that it has on the larger number of society. So those are our objectives. That is our lesson for today. If you have any questions, please do either watch the video again or come find me. I'm always happy to help. Other than that, you have a fantastic day. Until next time, we're signing off.